Build Right is the educational division of Sparkbox, working to inspire and empower a web built right. For more information about Build Right or to have one of our workshops at your company or event, check out buildright.io. If you'd like to have Sparkbox help you make your web better, visit csparkbox.com. You're watching Brad Frost's Build Right Maker Series on Atomic Design from March 26th of 2015. The Build Right Maker Series is brought to you by the folks at Sparkbox and these generous sponsors. DataYard, performance-driven cloud hosting for kick-ass websites and applications. Campaign Monitor, a simple and elegant email marketing software for business. Shopify, a hosted, theme-based e-commerce platform. Harvest, simple time tracking, professional invoicing, powerful reporting software. Additional thanks to our secondary and giveaway sponsors for their help in making the Build Right Maker Series possible.
My name's Brad Frost. I actually am not from too far away. I drove over here from beautiful Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So if any of you guys make it over there, make sure you say hi. We have a nice little development and design community there. So, but yeah, so this is me in my element. I've been working with the web on mobile devices for about 5 years now. I consider myself to be pretty fortunate to sort of have had a chance to roll up my sleeves and get my hands dirty with sort of creating web things for all of these different devices. Maybe just a year or two before it became sort of imperative for everybody to sort of go this way. I've had the opportunity to contribute to a couple books, tech editing contributors or whatever. Writing a book right now on atomic design. I'm doing it all out in the open. We could talk about that a little later, but yeah, I'm sort of almost done with the first chapter and stuff, but it's been pretty cool actually to sort of share it as I've been going. Also created a couple of resources. This is Responsive, which is a collection of responsive design patterns and resources, basically anything you need to get up and running with responsive design. Along with Anna Debenham, helped make a site and sort of maintain a site all about style guides and pattern libraries and all of the stuff that we're actually going to get into today. So if you want sort of examples, resources, tools for creating style guides and all of that stuff, and we actually even just created a podcast about style guides, and we'll sort of I'll hint at that stuff throughout the day. But yeah, so that's sort of a relatively new resource that's been a lot of fun. And sort of before all of this stuff, made a site called Mobile Web Best Practices. At the time, there wasn't really any sort of resource out there, that sort of aggregated all of those sort of best practices. Also, along with Jen Simmons, curated a blog called WTF Mobile Web, which is what not to do when creating for the web for mobile devices. So if any of your sites are on there, I apologize. My own sites are on there too. It's okay. It's it's no hard feelings. But yeah, and then I used to work at an agency, and so I got a chance to work with a lot of these big brands. I was at an agency called RGA in New York City, and had a chance to work with all of these different brands. And I don't really show this to sort of puff out my chest or anything. I show this because it's nobody knows what they're doing. Even if you don't work for a huge organization, it's oh, well, these people have billions of dollars to throw around. Surely they have this stuff figured out. No, they don't. We're all, for me, it's sort of comforting, actually, that fact that nobody knows and you can't just throw money at things in order to sort of, solve problems. So that's that. But yeah, that's my background. And sort of since going out on my own, I've done some work for Time Inc. and a couple AOL properties, Entertainment Weekly, some other stuff, which I'll actually get into today. So that's me. That's the sort of boring bit. For the sake of time, I don't think that we'll go around every single person in here, but just to give me a better idea of sort of, who you guys are, where you're coming from, all of that stuff. Raise your hand if you would call yourself a UX designer. Like, you're working, and again, like your titles are hard, your job description's hard, it's a big blob. Like, so if you consider yourself to be like someone responsible for crafting a user experience, like, yeah, okay. How about like a visual designer? You're responsible for like the aesthetic experience, right? Things like, you know, color, typography, texture, and stuff like that, and layout, and okay. Geez, you guys are like, you need to like big it, yeah. Don't make you do jumping jacks. What about sort of front end developers? People responsible for HTML, CSS, sort of writing some code, but not necessarily like, you know, writing crazy middleware. What about those middleware people? Like sort of, I think that there's like a clear divide between like, you know, people writing HTML and CSS and maybe some presentational JavaScript, and like JavaScript people, like any hardcore JavaScript people in here? Like, awesome. Much respect for you. Backend people, any sort of server side? Okay, yeah, cool. What about sort of managers? You're managing a team, you're a project manager, you run a team that is responsible for making web stuff happen. Okay. Any business people, like any sort of client people that are all right. No, that's good. So all right. So we have sort of like a front end sort of skew a little bit, but we still have a really good smattering of people here. So that gives me a good idea of sort of who you guys are and sort of how I can talk about things. So I will show like some codey things, but you know, any non-technical people, please don't puke. It's fine. We'll sort of get through it. So here's the basic plan of attack for today. I'm going to talk about atomic design, what that is, pattern lab, what that is, how to adjust their process and workflow to sort of account for this sort of pattern-based thinking. And then that'll sort of be the morning session. And then after lunch, we're going to have sort of a unique, we'll say, Q&A section. And then it's sort of like free form. So, you know, we're here. We could sort of take a look at some stuff. You know, I could do some demo stuff. We can, you know, just have conversations. And that's what I'm particularly excited about, sort of the afternoon, to just like sort of have this be nice and conversational, and really throughout the day, that's meant to be sort of the case, where like it's pretty casual. I'm not a very professional guy. I mean, look at me. I've been in the woods for 6 months preparing for this workshop, or so it looks. But yeah, so you know, just if you have questions, if you have, you know, like anecdotes, your own stories, or you know, want to sort of say like, oh, this has worked for me and stuff, feel free to just shout it out or raise your hand if you feel more comfortable. And I know we're gonna have like a dedicated Q&A section later on in the day, but like, just, you know, you guys are here, and I'd love to sort of hear this stuff a little bit up front about, you know, what you want to get out of the day. What are sort of burning questions that are on in your mind that you want to make sure that we cover, so that whenever you get back to your office, whenever you get back to your work, you'll have the answer to that question. Does anybody want to start off? Anybody want to learn anything today? Yeah. Yeah, how do you maintain a living style guide? What does that workflow look like? And yeah, we're absolutely going to get into that for sure. Yes?
Maintaining parity between sort of the design side of the style guide, like PSDs and whatnot, and the code side of the style guide.
Okay, yeah. So how do we maintain the sort of like living style guide feel, not just for the final code base, but for also those more static sort of design tools and stuff? Interesting. we could chew on that, sure. So yeah.
How a developer can persuade design teams to get out of waterfall static comps into a design system.
Yeah, physical violence. No, we'll talk all about that. Yeah, and I think that we'll dive into that for sure in a great deal of detail. Anybody else? Surely, more than 3 people came here to, yeah.
Sort of along the same lines of maintaining a style guide, but in an enterprise where you have 6,000 IT people and dozens of different websites to maintain.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you, does it even make sense to have a centralized style guide in an enterprise where a small group of people may not be able to actually maintain that, right? We need to disperse it out.
Yes.
And get maintenance across the enterprise, but then how do you check to make sure that things don't get out of control?
Yeah. So one, like, how do you scale something? How do you enforce? How do you govern? How do you make sure that an organization that has tons of different teams, tons of different people touching stuff, that a style guide is both useful, but maybe also flexible enough for them to do things a different way. So yeah, we could certainly talk about that a little bit more. And as you might expect, the answer is, well, it really depends. It depends on who's in the organization, how things are structured, and so on and so forth. But we could certainly touch on that, just because I do think that it's not like, oh, well, we're too big, so therefore none of this stuff, it's not worth doing. I don't think that that's the right mentality. So, yeah, cool. Anybody else? Yeah.
I think in the same kind of surrounding veins of enterprise and multiple teams, like what teams did you need to engage when you're doing things for enterprise level?
Yeah.
Everything down to like file server. What infrastructure did you have to put in? Like, what do those timelines look like? What do those budgets look like? All the logistics of.
Yeah, the logistics of, and I think that the broader question, the logistics of making a style guide and implementing it, who's involved, how much does it cost, and all of that stuff. And I think that that's like the sort of overarching thing. It's like, what's the level of effort to make this thing happen? And we could, we'll dive into that for sure. And again, the specifics around how much something costs or like what infrastructure totally depends on the organization. But I do think that there's some general principles and sort of mentalities that you could adopt that makes it a lot easier to get the thing off the ground. And it's sort of like quick answer is like to treat it as a separate thing is sort of not the way to do it. You sort of need to Trojan horse it in a little bit, and actually that proves to be a lot more effective. So we could get into that a little later, though. Sure. Yeah.
I'd like to hear about how there are different solutions to different kinds of problems. So I know we're going to be talking about Pattern Lab, but Style Guides site has all sorts of different kinds of style guides. I'm sure they come in all sorts of flavors and shapes and sizes. So
Yep.
Just curious about what flavors work for what organizations or maybe specific use cases.
Yeah, Pattern Lab or leave right now. Everybody. No, I'm just kidding. Like, no, it is true. It depends very much on like how you're set up, what technology stacks you're using, what designers and developers are comfortable with, and all of that stuff. And thankfully, again, like there's this site that we've put together is actually really quite nice to be able to aggregate all of these tools under one roof, and so that you can sort of pick and choose, which things are going to work well for you. We'll also talk about the different types of style guides, sort of how they all sort of play into each other. That's not like the primary focus of that of the session, but at the same time, I think it is really important to be aware that like, front-end style guides and like pattern libraries, like what we're dealing with, do play into sort of a broader ecosystem. So sort of like knowing what that whole landscape looks like, I think, is really important as well. So, one more. Somebody. Yes.
More from a general standpoint, like maybe stories of failure and how you learn
Yeah.
And what can you tell us about that?
Sure.
So,
Yeah. Is it a little hard because I've never failed at anything? Just kidding. No, absolutely. Yeah, I've been through plenty of wailing and gnashing of teeth, and we'll talk about that and talk about some sort of strategies out of some of those pitfalls that I've lived through, sometimes repeatedly, many times repeatedly. So yeah, cool. Well, that's awesome. Anybody else before we sort of? Okay. Again, trying to keep this really conversational. We're all, it's sort of a good-sized room. We're all sort of here. So just like shout things out. If you need clarification on anything, let me know. If you want to add your own thing, just shout it out, raise your hand or whatever. If you want to call bullshit on anything, please do. I love that. I absolutely love that. So yeah. So again, we're all here. We got donuts. We got coffee. Like, this is a good day. This will be a fun day. So, all right. Getting into things, atomic design. This idea of sort of page has been actually with us for a couple millennia now, is shortly after like 0 AD, the first actual like book with bound pages and the thing that you could flip through. So the concept of the page is actually a little over 2,000 years old now, which is pretty wild. And this, as in a very real way, has dramatically sort of shaped the way that we read, shaped the way that we perceive information and how it's displayed and all of that. And that has been absolutely baked into the DNA of the web. Tim Berners-Lee, working at CERN, he's an academic guy, scientists wanting to share their documents with each other, and so the web was sort of born out of this sort of very academic, very sort of page-based document sort of world. And so naturally, we still think of the web as these sort of series of pages. If you were to go to a URL that doesn't exist in Chrome, it says this web page is not available, right? It's like it's very much part of the vocabulary of the web, and as such, we tend to talk about our enterprise level sites, and we have thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of pages, and oh my God, like how overwhelming is that? And we talk about how long web pages are going to take to make, right? Brad, how long is the home page going to take? Sort of depends on what's on the home page, right? It's like, is it hello world? I'll have it done in an hour, right? If it's something more than that, it's going to, take a lot longer. So, but again, so this tendency to think of things as pages just doesn't really scale now that this is our reality, right? Having these, we are tasked with creating these interfaces that are meant to be, displayed on all of these different devices, and some that aren't even pictured there, right? So this notion of the page, like here's what your web page is going to look like on a MacBook Pro. Here's what your web page is going to look like on an iPad, and here's what your web page is going to look like on an iPhone. Just out of morbid curiosity, anybody work at a place that creates comps like this? Okay, mostly on this side. Anybody else? Yeah, come on, keep them up, it's okay. It's all right. But yeah, like this is this is what is known as a tremendous waste of a talented person's time, right? Nothing more, nothing less. It's not enough to just be like, oh, well, now we need to show what it looks like on these devices. It's always these, too. Have you ever noticed that? It's like it's always an iPad, it's always an iPhone. It's either MacBook Air, a MacBook Pro, or like a cinema display, right? We like tilt them slightly, right, to impress our clients. I was like, ooh, yeah, all right. This whole responsive thing. But yeah, so we quite literally need to blow up, not just this workflow, but really our mental state, right? We need to rethink and actually blow up our interfaces. And I've been thinking about this question for a while now, just because I've been working on, different projects that are about sort of responsive design patterns and stuff like that. But this question of what are our Lego bricks, right? What are our Subway sandwich pieces that we can combine into millions of different delicious combinations, right? What are raw materials, and sort of how do we think about that a little smarter? And again, I've been sort of thinking about this for a while, because that This Is Responsive site that I mentioned earlier is this collection of patterns for how to actually, take navigation and do some stuff with it. And here's breadcrumbs, and let's do some stuff with it. And here's data tables, and let's do some stuff with it. So this sort of breaking things down allows us to create more thoughtful, responsive interfaces. So, Stephen Hay wonderfully articulated, we're not designing pages anymore, we're designing these systems of components. And that's especially true in the responsive age, just because this responsive stuff is hard. Anybody using or played around with Foundation by Zerb? Raise them up. Okay, where are my Bootstrap people? Some up, higher. Not judging you. Maybe no, I'm just kidding. No, but these things are great. It's responsive design's hard. These things provide this nice UI toolkit, this system of components, right? That allow us to sort of quickly assemble web interfaces, and that's awesome. So in concept, I'm totally on board with these things. So I like them, but this is my big issue with these things are. So it comes to this. Look at all these happy people here. Whenever I'd watch sci-fi movies as a kid and stuff, I'd be like, I guess if we just give it enough time, we'll solve fashion. It's just hey, how about we just wear jumpsuits from now on? And then everybody's like, sure. Cool, done. Moving on, music is next, right? Let's figure out what we're gonna listen to. But obviously, this isn't how human beings work, right? We all have different needs, different goals, different desires, different wants. And so, it's a lot more complex than that. And sort of how that plays into, we on the web love to do this stuff, right? Oh, just use jQuery. Oh, never use jQuery. Just use WordPress. Never use WordPress. Use Grunt. No, use Grok. Use Broccoli. Why doesn't everybody just standardize on WebKit? And, we have this tendency, with technology, with the web, to try to be why can't everybody just see things the way I see them? Just use Bootstrap. Never use Bootstrap, right? So coming back to Bootstrap, Foundation stuff, these are solutions. These are not the solution, these are solutions. But the problem is that because these things are utilized so much, Bootstrap is the most watched repository on GitHub. It's huge, it is massive. And because you have so many different people using it, using these same tools, these provided solutions for problems, all of a sudden you have a lot of sameness, right? Go to any startup's website and you will see Bootstrap and you will see substantial similarity. If Nike, Adidas, Puma, Reebok were to all use Bootstrap in redesigns of their projects, they would look substantially similar. And that's sort of not what they're going for, right? It's that sort of differentiation that sort of sets us apart. It's about sort of using the right tools and building the right tools to sort of solve the unique problems that the organization faces. So, and again, it's not to say you can't skin Bootstrap to make it more custom, but there comes sort of a point of diminishing returns wherever it actually takes more effort. You find yourself fighting the framework and sort of undoing the default styles and stuff that are provided to you, when you could just be making your own sort of system. Very often these frameworks give you a lot of stuff. They give you a lot of solutions, drop downs, carousels, whatever. You might not end up using everything that a framework gives you, but the user has to download and incur all that extra sort of extra weight. On the flip side of that coin, they might not go far enough, and you might find yourself having to write a bunch of custom code anyways. How do you work in this new code base, right, with your existing sites, with your existing structure? But then, and this is a big one, especially for a lot of the front-end developers in the room, right? You're subscribing to how someone else has named things and structured things. And I've found that we as front-end developers are an opinionated bunch. I personally don't want to write class equals Jumbotron in my code. That sort of feels weird to me. I don't know. So these, again, these tools like Bootstrap, I think conceptually they're amazing, but at the same time, it's about, you know, it is important to sort of point out these sort of shortcomings. So a lot of people might know Dave Rupert, co-host of the Shop Talk Show podcast, and but he works at a small design agency based out of Austin, Texas, called Paravel. They worked on redesign of Microsoft.com, and Dave was talking about their deliverables, like what they were actually handing off to Microsoft as this giant organization, and he really just sort of encapsulated things so nicely, this idea of sort of like tiny bootstraps for every client. And he sort of, what he means by that, he says, responsive deliverables should look a lot like fully functioning Twitter Bootstrap style systems that are custom tailored for your client's needs. So it's not just about like, you know, using a system, it's about crafting a system that's custom tailored to fit your particular needs, your particular problems and opportunities. So it's just like, I think that he just nailed it. And this is sort of where we're at. And because of that, we've sort of seen the rise of a lot of these sort of front-end style guides, as Anna Debenham calls them. If you haven't gotten this book from Anna yet, I highly, highly, highly recommend it. Somebody put it in the notes, just because it's like $2 or like £2, which is whatever. And it'll take you like 2 hours to read, but it's just like this really nice little book that sort of articulates the many benefits of creating front-end style guides. And in the book, and sort of expounded on a couple here, why these front-end style guides, why creating these systems really matter, is we're promoting consistency and cohesion, right? Sometimes across a really large organization, right? Makes things easier to test, right? You're able to sort of isolate a certain pattern and figure out where things are breaking, right? Establishes a better workflow, which we'll get into in great detail today. Create a shared vocabulary between every member on the team, which we'll talk about in more detail later, but this is absolutely huge. This, for my money, is one of the best and most visible sort of outcomes of establishing your own design system. Of course, this is a useful reference to keep coming back to. What do my H2s look like? What do my tables look like? What does, these sort of, different elements look like? And of course, these things are meant to be a foundation for growth, right? This solid platform that you could build with, grow with, expand, and extend over time. So as a result, we see, a lot of these different tools out there. This one's from a guy named Brett Jankard, the Style Guide Boilerplate, which is a nice little sort of static document on GitHub. Jeremy Keith has one called Pattern Primer. It's like a little PHP loop that just sort of spits through, goes through, rips through a folder of HTML files and sort of generates a pattern library. Paul Robert Lloyd over in the UK sort of took that same concept and sort of expanded it upon it. This is called Bare Bones. And whenever you crack open the hood on this, it's like, okay, here's what our header looks like. Here's what our paragraphs look like. Here's what small text look like. Here's what a horizontal list link or link list looks like. Here's what a vertical link list looks like, right? Here's what our forms look like, right? Here's what a note underneath the form field looks like. Here's what that little required aspect or asterisk looks like. We've also seen an increasing amount of these things being released out into the wild, right? Code for America, which was done by Anna Debenham and the Clear Left folks over in the UK. Just phenomenal work. Definitely recommend checking it out. MailChimp released their pattern library. It's just gorgeous. It's their sort of like second edition of it. Yelp, sort of bigger companies, coming out with theirs. They make a reference to atomic design. It's pretty cool. But it really all started with the Starbucks style guide. Has everybody seen this? Yeah. It's like this for me. This was like, like the Boston Globe was like the big seminal, responsive redesign. It's like, yeah, this is the thing. Like, this is what we're doing from now on. This Starbucks style guide, I think, was very much like the Boston Globe of this type of thinking. So yeah, Starbucks went responsive, about 3 years ago now, I think. And whenever they released their new site, they also released their style guide. And it was just like, again, just this like, shining light, and you crack open the hood and it's like, okay, well, what does this thing contain? And it's like, okay, well, they have a pattern that's called blocks 3 up. And blocks 3 up is just this, here's this little chunk of interface that they're going to be using throughout their site. And they've given it a name, right? You could sort of see how it works in a responsive environment, right? Here's another one called a featured list, right, with a little thumbnail, little headline, little excerpt, pretty common pattern. They're going to be reusing this throughout the entire interface. Here's their data tables, right? The top one, 3 columns that can easily squish onto smaller screens, right? But then here's a more complex table. And how does that work? How does that transform itself to better fit on smaller screens, right? So I love these. I think that, this is absolutely the way we need to be designing and developing in 2015 and beyond. Absolutely, hands down, I think that this is nothing but a good thing. But with all that being said, these things are time-consuming to create, right? Sort of back to your question about, what's this level of effort? How long is this going to take? How much is this going to cost us, right? What's the real effort involved? Very often they're treated as an auxiliary project, right? It's like this, oh yeah, let's make a style guide, right? And it's like, again, well, put together a proposal, do all of this stuff, and it's like, well, it's sort of part of the actual website itself, or the app, or whatever the hell you want to call your things these days. It's part of the thing, but but at the same time, we're sort of like treating it as a separate thing. And whenever you treat something as a separate thing, it becomes really easy for those things to fall off. And it's like, oh, we didn't get that budget, so that's the thing that's got to go, right? We need to get this thing out the door, right? I'm sure all of us are under the gun to try to get their projects out the door. It's like, yeah, this is great, but it's not the actual thing, and it's a distraction, and whatever. Oftentimes, these things are too abstract. You don't get a sense of where blocks 3 up gets used, right? Like where is that being utilized within the final interface? Oftentimes it's only seen as a designer or developer tool. And this is something I see time and time again. I do a lot of consulting work. I go in, talk to a lot of different organizations, and it's like these pattern libraries, these tools, sometimes they're just owned by the front end people. Sometimes there's a visual style guide that's just meant for people working in tools like Photoshop and Sketch and things like that. And of course, nobody's like, oh yeah, maybe our project managers and maybe these other people should know about it too. Oftentimes they're created after a project launches, sort of, again, treating it as an auxiliary project, and you sort of get the site out the door and then sort of cherry pick patterns after the fact. oftentimes they only serve present use cases. So, say for example, like video might not be a big incentive for you right now, or it might not be a big initiative at your organization, but then all of a sudden you get the news. It's like, hey, video is going to be a big part of what we're doing from now on. Wouldn't it be great to already have that sort of accounted for, at least, having like what a video tag might actually, how that stuff might react within a certain system. And then the sort of last thing, this is the thing I really sort of latched onto, is like, there isn't really a methodology sort of behind a lot of this stuff. I see a lot of these style guides released into the wild, and while I think that that's awesome, for the most part, they're just sort of like sprays of modules, right? It's just like, here's a clump of components, right? And, sometimes there's some loose categorization and stuff like that, but I'm just like, this is great, but like, surely there's a thoughtful way to sort of put this stuff together. So that's what sort of led me down this wormhole that I'm now calling atomic design. So I kept coming back as I started thinking about this. Kept looking for parallels. I'm like, what other areas? I'm like, surely we're not alone in this. And I kept coming back to my high school chemistry class. So this is a weird slide. My high school chemistry teacher, he looked a lot like Wilford Brimley. So I couldn't find an actual picture of my high school chemistry teacher, so Wilford Brimley will do. But he was a badass. He was a sniper. It was crazy. He had like a belt buckle with like guns on it. It was really weird. He was like the hardest teacher I ever had. And he had like this giant pack of papers, and we'd have to balance these chemical equations. And it was like meant to, again, being the badass he was, and sort of like hard ass too, he'd hand this out with a little grin on his face, like, oh, this is gonna take you guys forever to have to do all these equations. But like, I loved it. Like, I just ate it up. I got it done in like 3 days, and it was like unheard of. But yeah, so it's looking for these parallels, and sort of kept coming back to like, this idea of sort of chemistry and stuff, and that because in the natural world, all matter is comprised of these sort of finite set of atoms, and these atomic elements, right, hydrogen, oxygen, have their own properties. They can't be broken down any further without losing their meaning, without losing their properties, right? You can't actually get, I've had loads of people send me emails and get pull requests and stuff that are like, what about quasars? I'm like, shut up. And it's true, like these things are actually comprised of even smaller bits, but like what matter is actually made of is, this is the basic building blocks of life. So atoms are sort of abstract on their own, right? They have these properties, but they're not terribly useful on their own, I should say. It's whenever you start combining them together, right? So hydrogen and oxygen coming together to form a water molecule, and that's where things start getting interesting. Those molecules keep combining together, forming more complex molecules. Eventually, we sort of build up into these sort of relatively simple organisms, which keep combining further to create more complex organisms. I did a Google image search for people, and this dude came up. I'm like, yep, you're going in my slides. It's like pretty representative dude in beret and windbreaker. It's got a nice little reflective drop shadow. I'm like, that is just perfect. But yeah, so like, more complex organisms, and really, and I kept him in there, but like all matter in the known universe is comprised of this finite set of atomic elements. And as it turns out, we on the web have this too. This is a guy named Josh Duck, I think he's now at Facebook, and he's since sort of taken this offline, which is really unfortunate. But he put together the periodic table of HTML elements. And you could actually paste in your URL, and it would actually like highlight the elements that you're using in your site, which is really cool. But yeah, so it's a shame that it's sort of offline. But like just this notion of like, yeah, like we have these same sort of finite building blocks that we're using to construct every one of our interfaces, right? Whether you're working on some crazy app, whether you're working on a blog, whether you're working on an e-commerce site, whether you're working on something else, it's all the same stuff. So, because of that, we can use that same process that happens in the natural world and apply that same process to our interfaces. So that's what atomic design is it's this set of 5 distinct phases, and I'm not saying steps, 5 distinct sort of like layers to constructing an effective interface design system. And I'm just going to I'm going to repeat this throughout, but again, this is not a linear process. I'm not recommending you start with buttons and you design buttons in isolation and then sort of go step by step. That's not it. It's 5 distinct sort of phases or sort of like layers of this. So I'll sort of talk about what this is in a little more detail. Atoms. Again, like atoms in nature, right? Can't be broken down any further, not terribly useful on their own. We have things like a label, an input, a button, right? Click a button in space, doesn't do anything, right? It's not terribly useful on its own. So whenever you get up to the molecule level, we're sort of taking those atoms and actually combining them together into this relatively simple component, right? This relatively simple module. Now all of a sudden that label means something, right? It's defining that input. And now all of a sudden clicking that button actually does something, right? So you have this sort of relatively simple component that's sort of built for reuse. It's sort of, following good programming principles of, sort of like single responsibility, blah, 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 all of that stuff. Now we take this at the organism level. What we're doing is we're taking this search form molecule and we're putting it into context, right, of a header organism. And then header organism might be comprised of a logo atom, right, primary navigation molecule, search form molecule, right? We see this on like literally any site we go to, right? You go and you're going to see these sections of a site, and a header is a great example of like the sort of self-contained bit of functionality, bit of interface that sort of, operates on its own, or whatever. And you might have organisms that are comprised of a bunch of different stuff, right? Like a header is like an image and an unordered list and a search form and all of that stuff. Or it might be like a tweet list organism, right? That's comprised of the same tweet molecule repeated over and over and over again, right? So what we're doing is we're sort of, putting these sort of relatively simple components in the context of even bigger ones. So here's where the metaphor ends. I learned very early on that if you continue on with it, people will think you're batshit crazy. So eventually you need to get into language that really makes sense for, for clients, for users, for people actually building web stuff. So that's why we sort of abandon that stuff and get into things like templates and pages. So we now have this header organism, and now we put it into context of something. Go, damn you. Something that resembles a web page. And this isn't the final level. The big thing here, this template level, which actually didn't exist whenever I first made the whole atomic design thing. There was just sort of 4 steps, 4 stages. But the big thing here is what we're doing at this template level is actually focusing on the content structure. And Mark Bolton had this really great post about sort of in defense of lorem ipsum and placeholder text and placeholder content and stuff like that, because a lot of people sort of took content first a little too literally, right? And they're like, oh, well, I'm not going to start my job until, hey, How's it go, man? People took this idea of like sort of content first too literally, and we're like, oh, I'm just going to sit on my hands until you give me the final copy deck or until you give me all the final images, and that's just not practical or pragmatic or anything like that. So what Mark was talking about in this great post is basically saying, he's like, no, you don't need the final content for the site in order for you to get to work. You just need to know what your content structure is, right? You need to know, right, if you're making an e-commerce site, it's like, okay, well, what's the size of the photography that we have to work with, right? How long are the product names, right? What are the different product options, and so on and so forth, right? It's the sort of underlying content structure that allows us to sort of do our jobs. And then at the page level, what we're doing is we're taking these templates with their sort of placeholder stuff, their sort of scaffolding, skeletal stuff, and pouring in real, actual working content into it. And so this is obviously a really important phase, just because this is what your end users are going to be interacting with. This is what your clients and your bosses are going to be signing off on. This is sort of where most of the eyeballs are going to be, right? Because this is the final sort of interface. But why this stage matters so much is well, a bunch of reasons. Really, it's, again, sort of all of this stuff is happening concurrently, right? You're sort of creating the final experience, this thing, and you're also simultaneously creating the underlying system. And it's at this level here is where whenever you actually pipe in real actual content, you're able to test the resiliency of the system, right? Does this hold up, right? Does this hero unit still work whenever we pipe in a different image, right, with different dimensions or whatever? Or what happens whenever this headline is 400 characters rather than 40 characters? Right? And so it's at this stage where we could actually test variations of the actual sort of content and actually sort of pipe in real stuff and see where things break. And whenever those things break, we go back through and sort of solve them at a more atomic level. It's also at this stage that we're able to sort of test variations of a specific template. So say, for example, you have a home page, but then you also have an alert message that shows whenever let's say you work for a bank and your credit card's been hacked or whatever, right? And so whenever you log into the dashboard, that's what you see is a bright red banner that says, like, you need to call us immediately, right? Still the same template, still the same dashboard template, but there's a variation of that includes that sort of alert message. So it's at this page level that gives us a place for us to sort of design out those different variations, all leading to a more thoughtful, more resilient system.
You talk about all these different stages and levels. At what point would you say the client needs to be at these levels? Obviously, what you just said seems like just the pages of templates, and the other stuff should be more internal.
Yeah, what I've found is like clients only care about like the final bits. Yeah. And you're like, atoms, molecules, and they're like, yeah, cool. I don't know. Yeah, what do you want? What do you want from me? I guess. What I found is, like they care about the final work. They're more concerned with that, and totally understandably so. But that being said, they're exposed to all of this, and this is for a lot of different reasons. One is to help them understand that, like, no, we're not just making you a pretty web page, right? That's not what we're doing. What we're actually doing is building this really thoughtful, really sound ecosystem, this whole design system for you to live with and grow with and extend over time. It also sort of helps remove what I call special snowflake syndrome, which is like, you have one department like, no, but we're different, you don't understand, so therefore we need a totally different design, and it needs to be purple and look totally different. And it's like, whenever you expose the clients and the rest of the organization to like the whole design system, even though they're not going to focus there, for them to be aware what we're doing is creating this really sound system, it helps them better appreciate what it is you're doing, right?
Well, some clients want to know what's your design process. So,
Mm-hmm.
at what point, I mean, I'm thinking, do you tell them, oh, we use atomic design, or do we use a system-driven design, or we use a style guide-driven
Yeah,
design?
yeah.
I mean, you recommend a good, I mean, some clients, if you say atomic design, I think they're just going to go, that's sciencey.
Yeah. So literally on the drive over here yesterday, I was on a call for a project that hopefully we get. But we were talking to the potential client, and I was sort of saying, what we're doing is not just making you a new website. What we're also delivering to you is a really sound interface design system that allows you to sort of spin up future web pages and stuff faster later on down the road. Like, let's say you add a new section to your site, you can use the components that we've given you. So it's not just going, it's going to save you a lot of money in the long run. I don't really get into like atomic design. Like, I don't say like, oh yes, and we're a certified atomic design shop. Like none of that. It's about being like, we follow a very pattern-based design and development workflow, and this is why that's advantageous for you. And they're like, cool, that sounds good, right? I like saving time. I like saving money. I like reusing things. I like things looking consistent. So yeah, so right at the sales process and then all the way through, you're just sort of beating that drum, repeating it over and over again, helping them understand why this is so important.
Right.
Yep.
So when you go through like the discovery phase and like combining different atoms and molecules, like how do you, and then you get in and you start building and everything, and you decide, you get things into like the template of the page and like, oh hey, this isn't gonna work enough, maybe we need to make this new molecule. You just kind of like keep it all in rotation?
Yep, that's it. And again, like, it's not like we're starting with atoms and molecules and then sort of building them up and then like figuring out like, oh shit, they don't work together. It's like, it's all sort of happening concurrently. And yeah, you do run into those things where it's like, okay, so, we did the dashboard template, we did the detail template, or I'm trying to keep abstract here, but it's like, oh, we can maybe reuse this pattern here. And you start going down that road, and it's like, oh, crap, like it doesn't do everything we need it to, so therefore we need to create another molecule or whatever that's going to better serve that thing. And so, yeah, so it's like all sort of, it's like you put together a puzzle, and then you realize that there isn't a puzzle piece there, and so you need to go through and make one and then put it in place. It's sort of, so yeah, so you're simultaneously, and the big thing here is like, you're concurrently doing this, you're simultaneously focusing on the part and the whole at the same time. And what I love that, and this is what I'd say is like the biggest advantage of atomic design, is that it gives you that ability to sort of take a step back and sort of see things blown apart. It's like, oh, what do my buttons look like? And like if you need that reference. And it's like, oh, what does my header look like? Or we're just having a conversation about the header, so let's just hone in on that. Frank Chimero, designer in Brooklyn, he has this really great line in he sort of tells a little story in his book, Shape of Design. And he talks about a painter, and it's like the painter's up against her canvas, and she's really focused in on like the detail, right? And she's working, and then she takes a step back, right? And she sees how that work impacted the whole, right? And then it's like this dance of like sort of doing and then reflecting. And I see this as being very similar. It's like you're sort of, working on these little components, and then you sort of take a step back to see how that impacts the whole. Yep. And then the other thing is I'd say that like, again, atoms aren't terribly useful on their own. They're like a nice reference to keep coming back to. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have pages. And pages are mostly there for review. Again, it's where you're testing the resiliency of the design. It's where you're sort of seeing everything come together in the final interface and seeing how it all feels together. But the real sort of work happens in between. And again, happening concurrently, but it's like, whenever you see at the page level, like, oh, this thing doesn't look right. it's like, okay, well, let's go into that little component and fix that, and then sort of take another look at it. So a lot of the build process, the designing and the building and stuff happens at those sort of middle layers. So yeah, this idea of like sort of component-driven design, systematic thinking has been around for a really long time. In fact, like people like Andy Clark have been talking about this for ages now. In fact, he actually wrote a chapter of a book called Designing Atoms and Elements, which I didn't know about it because it's in a book, and apparently I don't read enough. But yeah, so you know, this stuff has been around for a while, and we see, you know, in a lot of related fields, right? Things like, you know, CSS architecture and stuff. We have things like BEM and OOCSS and SMAX, stuff like that. But even interface design systems like YUI and jQuery UI, these things have been around since the early 2000s. So this is nothing new, and these things basically give you, it's like, here's your widget library, right? Here's your calendar picker. Here's your accordion. Here's your tabs, right? So this is nothing new. What I will say is that sort of what I think atomic design does, maybe a little differently, is that it sort of makes a differentiation between sort of relatively simple components and relatively complex components, and also makes a differentiation between those sort of templates and the pages. And I think that's sort of, you know, putting it all into sort of one, you know, sort of workflow has been pretty effective. So, yes?
Are you going to get into more about those like methodologies, especially like SMAX or object-oriented CSS and examples? So I feel like I get a lot of questions about using Pattern Lab and like SMAX as a whole. There's a lot of confusion because I see people create almost unreusable pieces of like an organism, and they're like styling it as like a page or something like a block, and then they break out into these like atoms that really only exist in the context of that organism.
Okay, yeah. Yeah,
So
so,
they like skip atoms and go directly to like the organism, and it's kind of like a backwards way of doing it.
yeah, so, well, to sort of take a step back, like, atomic design has nothing to do with CSS, period. So, like, you know, and again, I get lots of emails and lots of people showing me their GitHub repos. They're like, hey, I made atomic design CSS. I'm like, no, it's totally different. So, like, if you use SMAX, if you use OOCSS, if you use BEM syntax and stuff, and like I sort of use, I'm somewhere in between SMAX and BEM, and I don't know, I sort of go back and forth. But yeah, like as far as like sort of architecting sound markup, like you do want to encapsulate that stuff at like the sort of modular level. So I'd say like if you have like a block, like a media object or something, like that would be what I would call a molecule, right? It's like a little like avatar image and then a title and then, you know, some text or something. Like that's a relatively simple component, so that'd be what I call a molecule. But I'd write that in HTML as like, you know, dot media object or whatever. So that being said, like I think that was sort of like you were sort of touching on like how the cascade affects, how context affects how a component is displayed and stuff like that. So like if you have like, let's say you have a theme, like so an extra class on your body tag or something that's like switches it from light to dark or something like that. It's like you would need that context in order to see the thing. But yeah.
Maybe like simplifying it, like using a helper class, and like how you would recommend, like even an app that had a modified version of it, and especially if you get more like a modular context of it.
Yeah. So yeah, like so like even like a different state. Or something like that, or a variation of something. And it's like, yeah, like that, what we do with that, if you have like different patterns with different states, well, let me see if I could do the,
And if you go with that later.
Oh, no, that's fine. Just real quick, like I think that what I'll do is, does it not want to, yeah, let me see here. Okay. So this is what we did for. That's a nice little trick, Ben. Thanks for showing me. So yeah, so here's a good example. I might need to refresh it. So this is for a project that we'll talk about, Time Inc. And we had like different variations of like this sort of, we call it a factoid pattern. It's like a little one-liner, sort of tweetable little sort of thing that's meant to be, just like include a little bit of text. And we had like different variations of it for the project. And we sort of would demonstrate that and articulate that in the pattern library, but then we'd sort of have like a working pattern is the actual thing that we would use within Pattern Lab, and then sort of like use dynamic data to like assign the orange or the yellow class and stuff to it.
So then the actual HTML, is it based off of like a base one that you're then adding classes to?
Precisely.
And then you include one of those like variations or if this is just one list, are you then including like, I don't know where you are, but.
Yeah, we would include the default one, always.
Okay. And then inside like your next level, as you expand them, you're just including the default and adding those helper classes?
Yep, precisely.
Okay.
Yep, so what you want is like one actual like working component, and then, but you do want to articulate in your pattern library. It's like, oh, by the way, there's like a button with a class of loading attached to it or something, or oh, there's an alert message, but there's alert warning, there's alert error, there's alert validation, there's alert something else, right? So it's like you want to be able to articulate that stuff, but I'd recommend like in your actual sort of workflow, just like using the reusable thing. Yep. So atomic design, that's a methodology, it's the philosophy, it's the methodology, it's the mindset. In order to actually make this stuff happen and come to life, let me actually switch back into this. We actually created a tool called Pattern Lab. And what Pattern Lab is, is a tool created by Dave Olson and myself, more so Dave Olson these days. Dave is, he works at the web department at West Virginia University. He's a good programmer. I am a bad programmer, so it's a very good, nice little marriage, because I basically had this idea, I sort of prototyped it out, I was using it, but it was bad. And Dave took it and made it good, and continues to make it good. So 3 cheers for Dave. But what Pattern Lab is it's a static site generator, and it's basically like the way you actually stitch these atoms, molecules, organisms, templates, and pages together. So it makes these atomic design systems happen. At its core, it's a static site generator. So it happens, it all sort of like runs like locally on your machine and sort of stitches this stuff together and spits it out locally on your machine. It's not quite like a Jekyll kind of thing. Like you're not going to launch your site with it. It's not a CMS. It's not a replacement for like WordPress or Drupal or anything like that. And it just sort of is something that allows you to put these interfaces together. It's also it uses PHP, which a lot of people are like, PHP. And it's like, get over it, guys. It's that being said, and we could sort of talk about this maybe a little later. It's like, I use it with Grunt, and I use it with other things, and there actually is a Node port of it that's quite a bit behind, but still pretty good. Lots of people tend to use it and like it, but it sort of doesn't matter all that much. Like it's PHP is used to sort of stitch this stuff together, but really the final front end code that it produces can be really whatever you want. It's sort of like saying, well, what brand of engine does your car have in you? It's like, doesn't really matter because it's just making the car go. And as long as it's doing that, that's fine. What Pattern Lab is, it is meant to be and serve as your tiny Bootstrap for every client, right? So I've been using Pattern Lab to produce production-ready front-end code for the last 2 years now. And yeah, and that's sort of what it can be. It could also just be used as a prototyping tool. I've had native app developers use it and just chuck in a bunch of screenshots of their different components and use Pattern Lab to sort of stitch it all together for like nice little sort of almost like paper prototype sort of things, which is cool. So it is sort of like whatever you want it to be, I guess. It provides some patterns to get started with, a little more on that later. It provides some other tools that we'll talk about. But what Pattern Lab isn't is it's not Bootstrap, right? It's not Foundation by Zerb. It doesn't, you still have to do the work. You still need to design and develop what your website or web app or whatever is going to be. It doesn't give you any sort of, answers as far as that stuff goes. And that's, again, very much intentional. In fact, you can actually use Bootstrap or Zerb or whatever with Pattern Lab quite easily. It's not language, library, style, or workflow dependent. So if you like jQuery, cool, use jQuery. If you like Sass, use Sass. If you don't like those things, cool, you don't need to use them. Basically, Pattern Lab exists at sort of like a layer outside of your code, of the stuff that you're actually making. So it doesn't inject any sort of dependencies. It's not like, oh, please use jQuery in order to use Pattern Lab. Nope. That was like very intentional right out of the gate. It's like, no, you should be able to write your stuff however you want without any sort of conflicts. It's not incredibly rigid. You can bulldoze the whole atomic design metaphor completely. We've had people do that and have people do that all the time. Some people are like elements and then blocks and then something else, or elements and modules and components, and just use whatever language makes the most sense for your organization. I, of course, have a bias towards like the sort of metaphor, but again, Pattern Lab, allows you to sort of get rid of stuff. Some people even like just have two levels or 3 levels or whatever. And then I sort of have like a hard time still articulating what Pattern Lab is, because it's not like just a pattern library. It's not like, okay, here's your pattern library, but it's also, again, not like something you're going to launch your site with. It's sort of like somewhere in between a pattern library and your final thing. So I don't know. It's hard to understand what it is, but I'd say that it's more than just like a basic pattern library. So here's what it is. Looks like shit. That's intentional. Again, like instead of it's like, okay, how do we prevent people from actually just taking this and like using the sample code that we're putting in there just for demo purposes? It's like, well, if we make it look like garbage, then they'll be forced to rip that stuff out. And it's worked, which is awesome. But we still, of course, get people that are like, oh, why did you construct this? It's like, get rid of it. Like, yeah, it's crazy. But so what Pattern Lab does give you is it gives you a nice little sort of navigation across the top that gives you the ability to sort of dive into the different components and the different levels and stuff like that. So here's what that looks like, and then it has a sort of getting into this, color swatches. Right, things like that. And again, you could remove or add whatever you want into here, but it's like colors, an elemental aspect of your design, right? What swatches you're using, what those hex values or Sass variables are, whatever. Font stacks, again, another elemental important aspect of your design system. But even invisible things like animations, right? And fades and stuff like that. That stuff should be consistent across the board, right? So articulating that stuff is important, right? But then, of course, like headers, paragraphs, block quotes, inline text element, pre-formatted text, different image types, logo, big hero image, square image, avatars, icon fonts, loaders, fav icons, different image type or input types, different buttons, tables, and so on. And again, these are meant to be ripped out or extended based on your project's needs. So then at the molecule level, what Pattern Lab does is I'll sort of just show you. So one of the projects I did recently was a redesign of TimeInc.com, which is Time Inc., big magazine publisher, Sports Illustrated, Fortune, blah, 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 all of that stuff. So we made them a new website, and along with it, we included little components like this. So pretty common pattern. It's a heading, it's an excerpt, and it's a timestamp, right? Here's another one. Here's an image, it's a title, and an excerpt, right? Pretty common, relatively simple patterns. We're going to be using these things all over the interface. The way that we're actually making this stuff happen is using a templating language called Mustache, which is very sort of like language agnostic, which we'll talk about in a bit. And basically, so coming back to this component, if we crack open the hood under what's going on underneath here, right? So call it a block post, I guess. And you could see what's going on here. All the bits in orange is Mustache code. And we have little sort of inside the curly brackets, we have things like URL, headline, and excerpt. And that's like where sort of dynamic data can be sort of pumped into that stuff, which is cool. But then the big thing, and this is sort of like the backbone of what Pattern Lab is includes, right? Where you basically include smaller bits inside of bigger bits, right? So in this pattern here, this 400 by 300 image, I'm including with that little greater than sign, see that? And it says Adam's thumb. So that's what that is. It's a little include that basically says, okay, include this image, Adam, and pipe it in here, right? And so now we have this little chunk of markup, this little chunk of interface, and now we can use that and actually include that as its own little chunk inside of bigger things, right? So whenever we get up to the organism level, right, again, these relatively more complex components, we have something like a header. And if you crack open the hood of what that looks like, really we have a header, and then we're including the logo atom, we're including the primary navigation molecule, and we're including the search form molecule, right? And so now we can include that bigger component inside even bigger things, right, inside like the template. So whenever you get up to the template level, so this is what the homepage template for Time Inc. looks like. And you have this nice sort of, big sort of hero image and this little lorem ipsum sort of tagline. And as you scroll, you can see there's a pattern and a grid of 4, and there's that factoid. And then you can sort of see these patterns are repeated, right? So again, it's the same basic stuff. And again, what we're doing at this template level is we're focusing on the content structure. You can see that even in our headlines, we have things like the character count, right? Like 37 characters. It's like that's the max that thing could be. And we're sort of, that's intentional, but also pointing out our image sizes and so on. So whenever we crack open the hood of this, if you look, we're including the header, right? And at the very bottom, we'd be including the footer. And then we're including the hero area, we're including the story feature and the factoid pattern and all of that. And we're sort of wrapping it in this little sort of the pound sign and the trailing slash thing. Basically what that's doing is just sort of giving it a name or a namespace. And that just gives us something to latch onto, which will be important as I'll show next. So at the page level, what we're doing, again, is replacing that sort of grayscale, that lorem ipsum, that sort of placeholder content with actual, real representative content. And it's cool, and I want to say that what Rob was saying yesterday, that even with some of Sparkbox's clients, they're actually sort of pulling data from the live CMS and sort of piping it into like their static designs. again, getting into like that more realistic picture of like what the final content's going to be. So just sort of show you what that looked like for Time Inc. So again, we have that template, and then we're replacing it with, in this case, I'll sort of just go back and forth. Placeholder, pictures of Beyonce. And I think the biggest lesson learned from this entire project is that people love Beyonce. Like, so pro tip, you work at an enterprise, you work at a bank, you work at anything, pictures of Beyonce, people will be like, yeah, great, ship it. Like this, like, this is an easy way to get design approval. They're like, this is fantastic, yeah. True story. But you can see, so we've replaced that sort of stuff with real actual content. We have this picture of the figure skater. And it says champion storytelling at the Olympic Games. And as you sort of scroll down, we have these repeatable patterns, right? And what we're doing is we're actually sort of piping in dynamic content, right? Swapping in and out those images with sort of different stuff. And again, the way we're doing that, if just by giving things names and sort of wrapping them in that little sort of pound sign sort of trailing slash thing, that gives us the ability to sort of latch on to that stuff and sort of give it a name. And so we're saying, okay, the hero, the headline, we're going to give it, we're going to swap out that default lorem ipsum with this thing called moving people, right? And our image, our hero image, we're actually going to give it this image of hero_Beyonce.jpg, right? And as we sort of go down, right? So again, you remember that ice skater picture? It's like hero_skater.jpg, and then we're giving it, unique alt text. And we're also assigning a class to it. So back to your question earlier about sort of at the pattern level, assigning those like helper or sort of modifiers, I guess, modifier classes. Like in the actual markup, we have a place for like hero class. And by default, that's just like 0, right? That's nothing. But then at the page level, what we're actually doing is piping in those helper classes that actually sort of allows us to sort of modify colors or layout or whatever.
Switch the way that you kind of approach that because I don't know, I do it like 3 different ways this way, or making like a modified actual version of the atom, or extending like the base atom, putting a class, and then and it really depends. And the good news is, like you're saying, you have options. It's like sometimes a pattern is different enough wherever it necessitates its own thing. In this case, like hero class, changing it to experience, just to sort of go back a slide or two. What we're doing here, you can see this is like red text, and then we also had like different ones that were different colors. So this same component, that one right there, that one's blue, and then that one's actually a different color blue. The monitor's a little different, but like that's all we're using it for. So I'd say that fits squarely in like, yeah, that's just a little modifier. But like if I were to do like dramatic things with a layout or something, I'd be like, no, that's its own pattern. That's something different. So yeah. But yeah, so the big thing here is and again, like this content can come from just, you could write it manually yourself, or like Rob and the Sparkbox team were doing is like actually sort of taking like an export feed from the client CMS and actually sort of piping that stuff into your like static environment. So if I were to do like an e-commerce site, right, I could like grab a list of like 20 products and their names and their prices and their images and whatever, and actually sort of suck that stuff in and actually sort of display these product images like in a grid realistically, right? And so again, so coming back to how important it is to sort of test the resiliency of a pattern. This was for a product I was working on.
and we have like the same, again, the same little molecule repeated over and over and over again. And what I was doing by piping in different size names, I was trying to break the pattern, right? It's like, oh, what happens if somebody has some crazy long hyphenated name? Does this pattern hold up, or does it end up wrapping onto 3 or 4 lines, right? So again, like this is at its very core what Pattern Lab allows you to do. One, sort of include these, smaller patterns inside bigger patterns, sort of like Russian nesting dolls almost. And then sort of also gives you the ability to sort of swap out different data. And the last sort of core thing about Pattern Lab is this notion of what Dave calls pseudo patterns. And I sort of touched on this a little earlier. Wherever we have sort of like default data, let's say for you're working on an app, the user logs in, they see a screen, and that's the dashboard, right? But what if you also need to show what that dashboard template looks like the first time that user logs in, right? Like they just signed up for the service, so your dashboard might include a bunch of charts and graphs and recent activity and all of that stuff. Well, if it's their first time doing that, none of that stuff's going to be there, right? They don't have any data. So, maybe you want to introduce like a little sort of wizard or, tutorial. It's like, hey, here's how you use this thing, or welcome, including a welcome message. Same basic template, but you want to sort of show variations of that template. And so Pattern Lab gives you that ability to sort of quickly swap things out. And really all you need to do is like sort of, if you wanted to hide recent activity module, you could just sort of switch that to false and it won't show up. Same thing goes for like, let's say you log in and you're an admin. You have admin privileges. So maybe you're going to see a bunch of extra stuff that a regular user wouldn't see. Again, still the same template, but you're just sort of adding these modifiers to them. And really all you need to do is sort of just, switch some things on and off. So that is at its core what the hell Pattern Lab is. and I'll show you some more of sort of what that is, how we're actually working with it, and how we've sort of adapted our workflow to sort of make this stuff happen. But in the meantime, let's take a little break.
Thanks for watching the Build Right Maker Series. Check out our other videos from industry leaders at buildright.io. Or even better, buy a ticket and attend in person.